Welcome back to National Post Radio with Anthony Furey. Canada Talks, SiriusXM 167.
I was up in Ottawa over the weekend at the Manning Conference, and there was a segment on Albexit. Our friend Lauren Gunter was one of the speakers at that panel, along with a number of other Alberta luminaries who you'll be familiar with. And Lauren joined us on the program yesterday to talk about the perspectives that are going on. A lot of people kind of talking about separation again to really just show how frustrated they are with the situation on the ground. The government not helping them out with the oil sands sector. And I've asked people I know in Alberta, I've said, I hear these things about, 25% of office space in Calgary is not being leased. Is it true? Like, does the feeling of it match the statistics? Are you actually seeing empty space and for lease signs everywhere? And they say, yes, the lines in the food courts, in the promenades and the malls are smaller. And the traffic, you notice that there's less traffic downtown, which is, great, only exclusively in terms of not having traffic jams, but otherwise it is a terrible thing. So we have the convoy rolling up onto Parliament Hill saying, you got to back the oil sands. And then you've got these other people, and the Prime Minister is somewhat in league with them, Environment Minister Catherine McKenna, saying, all right, we got to get to 100% renewable energy. I mean, that's what the Green New Deal says in the United States that a lot of people are backing. And that's the general attitude. Well, if we have the willpower for it, we're going to make it happen. And maybe we'll build an extra 30 or 40 of those wind turbines. And there you go. Hope will spring eternal. Well, hold on a second. Doesn't really work that way. It's a massive ecosystem, a massive industry, lots of supply and demand going on all across the world, sectors and companies and countries interacting with each other to create our energy needs, our energy demands. Interestingly enough, while all of this was happening, these conversations happening, we had the head of the International Energy Agency visit Canada to do a talk on these sorts of issues, a data-driven approach to how this whole sector works. And what did we learn from that? Well, that it's not as easy as snapping your fingers. And this is the focus of a piece by Monica Gattinger, who's director of the University of Ottawa's Institute for Science, Society, and Policy, an associate professor at the University of Ottawa, also a fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Her piece is Canada's Energy Future and the Perils of Dangerous Optimism. Monica joins us now. Good morning, Professor. Welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for stopping by. It's a novel idea to not just be optimistic from one angle or the other, but to get some data out there and to use that to talk about where we need to be headed.
Absolutely. I think that's been one of the challenges in this sector, in this debate, is that we've got really increasingly polarized views on some of these topics, and they're not necessarily data-driven. And I think that's in many ways what compelled me to write this piece and to develop this concept of dangerous optimism.
And what part of the optimism is dangerous? What is the optimism? Is it that we can build the pipelines and get the Alberta sector going, or is it that we can sort of snap our fingers and have 100% renewable? Where are the challenges right now?
It's more so on the latter. I think, to your point, and you did a great introduction on that front, there do seem to be a lot of elements of our public debate that assume in some way that it's going to be really quite easy to decrease the GHG emissions profile of our energy systems. And it's one thing to look at a model that says we can go from, X to Y, but it's another thing to do that in the real world. And, I've been leading a research and engagement initiative at the University of Ottawa called Positive Energy for almost 5 years now. And in the course of that work, one of the things that we've seen is that communities don't necessarily accept energy projects. And sure, it can be pipelines that are in the news, but it can also be windmills, hydro dams, a whole host of different energy infrastructure projects that aren't necessarily going to be supported by communities, even though, a bunch of folks might wish that they were.
These are really ambitious targets, it seems, that Canada has set, our Paris Agreement and so forth, how many GHGs we're going to get rid of or how many tons and so forth. And you look at it sort of sectorally, and as my friend Laurie Goldstein often puts it, when you look at the emissions charts by sector and industry in Canada, it means to meet these targets, we'll almost have to close down an entire sector of our economy. I mean, even if you believe that we're at this horrible point where we need to act, acting in and of itself ain't that easy.
I think that's very true. I think the other element, though, is that some of our language around these issues isn't always that helpful. So we often talk about the debates often talk about low carbon transition and clean energy, and the fact of the matter is, if we're talking about climate, what we really need to be focusing in on is GHG emissions, and yet some of the language that we use almost is fuel deterministic in a way, right? And it sort of points people to the upstream, and to your point, shutting down a element of the Canadian economy that contributes substantially to the economy and society. And so we need to look really closely at what exactly is the objective here, and how do we go about meeting it? And if you look at the International Energy Agency, to your point about ambitious commitments, if you look at the IEA World Energy Outlook, their scenarios around including the Paris commitments still see a place for oil and gas, a very substantial place for oil and gas in 2040. And so I think the question for Canada then is, well, what position does the country see its oil and gas sector in that future?
So much of the conversation becomes, okay, we make these non-binding agreements, and then we turn around and we chastise ourselves for not even meeting them, ones that are sort of set off in a place at the other side of the world. I think most people agree they want to be responsible stewards for the environment. Just how constructive it is to have our whole debate around these sorts of agreements. President Donald Trump got a lot of criticism for withdrawing for the Paris deal. I remember, though, he said we still want to be the greenest country in the world, and then reports came out suggesting, I guess, that it was 2018, they saw a remarkable reduction in emissions while not signing on to that. Do we need to rethink how we do this whole sort of international commitment thing?
Well, my view is that we need to rethink how we do climate policy. And I think, the work that we've done at the University of Ottawa really suggests we need to make climate policy as if energy mattered. And I mean, I'm an energy student, as it were, and there are really key imperatives in energy: affordability, reliability, security. If you don't take those into consideration sufficiently when it comes to development of environmental policy and climate policy in particular, you really can see pushback. And we saw this in France with les gilets jaunes, right? So it's one thing to put in place carbon taxes, which all economists would agree are the way which we should go in terms of trying to reduce the GHG emissions intensity of our energy systems, of our economies writ large. But you have to do that in a way that takes into consideration, is energy going to be affordable? Is it going to be reliable? Will energy security imperatives be taken into consideration? And if you don't consider some of those broader matters, what you can find is that policy measures actually fail, because you've got a real pushback that comes, whether it's from individual citizens or consumers or industry.
Canada's Energy Future and the Perils of Danger It Faces, a piece by Professor Monica Gattinger, who's director of the University of Ottawa's Institute for Science, Society, and Policy. Professor, thank you very much for joining us this morning with your insights. We appreciate it.
Thank you.